The glossy brochures you pick up at the visitor center are a beautifully constructed lie. They show you sun-drenched valleys, smiling families, and majestic mountain peaks stretching into a perfect blue sky. They sell you the illusion of safety, convincing you that because a trail is marked and mapped, it is tamed. But the beauty of a national park is nothing more than a fragile mask worn by the ancient wilderness, a mask that slips away completely the exact second the sun dips below the jagged ridge line. When darkness falls, the postcard scenery dissolves into a vast, indifferent ocean of pure, terrifying isolation. The rangers know this, the locals know this, and the mountains themselves certainly know this. My name is the narrator, and tonight we are going to look behind that mask at the things they never print in the brochures. Our first account begins on a crisp, deceptively clear autumn afternoon with a hiker named Julian. Julian was an experienced backpacker who prided himself on his ability to read the terrain and navigate by compass. He was trekking along a well-frequented loop in the deep backcountry, a trail he had walked at least a dozen times before, but the woods have a strange, malicious way of shifting when you least expect it. As the twilight began to bleed into a deep, heavy purple, Julian noticed the forest around him change. The familiar oaks and maples seemed to crowd closer to the dirt path, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Then, without warning, the trail beneath his boots simply ceased to exist. It didn't fade out or get overgrown with brush. It just ended abruptly against a solid, impenetrable wall of ancient briars. He spun around to retrace his steps, but the path he had been walking just seconds ago was entirely gone, replaced by dense trees. Panic, sharp and cold, settled deep into his chest as he realized the true horror of his situation. The most terrifying thing wasn't the sudden loss of direction. It was the absolute, crushing silence that followed. The constant hum of cicadas, the rustling of small animals in the leaves, the wind in the canopy, all of it vanished instantly. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed against his eardrums, a dead silence that signaled an apex predator was near. He was entirely alone in a dark void where the natural laws of the world no longer seemed to apply. That suffocating quiet brings us directly to our second account, which took place in a remote valley miles away. A search and rescue team was dispatched to locate a young couple who had failed to return from a weekend camping trip. They tracked the coordinates to an isolated, unmarked clearing hidden deep within the dense spruce pine. When the team stepped into the clearing, they found the campsite looking entirely untouched at first glance. The campfire was cold, but the metal cooking pot still sat neatly on the iron grate over the ash. Their expensive hiking boots were lined up perfectly outside the small nylon tent, and their backpacks were zipped shut inside. But when the lead ranger shined his high-powered flashlight at the front of the shelter, the blood froze in his veins. The heavy fabric of the tent hadn't been shredded by the sharp claws of a bear or cut by a malicious human intruder. It had been violently torn open by a frantic, desperate force operating from the absolute inside. The jagged, shredded edges of the nylon were pointing outward, bursting away from the sleeping area into the dirt. It was as if whatever had arrived in the dead of night didn't force its way in to drag them out. Instead, something so deeply terrifying had manifested directly inside the tent with them that they tore through the walls to escape it. The surrounding mud showed absolutely no footprints leading away from the site, no signs of a struggle, and no blood. Just an empty clearing, an inverted ruin of a shelter, and a lingering scent of old copper and ozone. For the rangers who hunt for the lost, the wilderness often speaks back through the technology meant to save us. This brings us to our third account, involving a veteran wilderness ranger named Marcus working a lonely midnight shift. Marcus was stationed in a high timber-framed fire lookout tower overlooking a vast, uninhabited sector of the park. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the heavy silence of his cabin was broken by a sudden explosion of loud, violent static from his emergency radio. He reached over to adjust the squelch, assuming it was a routine atmospheric interference from a passing mountain storm, but as the white noise leveled out, a transmission began to bleed through. The speaker that defied all explanation. It wasn't a human voice calling for help, and it wasn't the standard digital telemetry of the Park Service network. It was the sound of breathing, heavy, wet, and immensely deep, echoing as if from the bottom of a stone well. The rhythmic intake of air was massive, far too large for human lungs, vibrating the glass windows of the tower. Between each wet, ragged breath, a low, metallic clicking sound hummed through the radio frequencies. Marcus picked up the receiver, his hand shaking, and demanded the unknown speaker identify their unit and location. The breathing stopped instantly. The heavy static cleared completely, leaving a dead, empty void on the line that felt colder than the air outside. Then a voice replied, but it didn't use words. It perfectly mimicked the exact tone, cadence, and pitch of Marcus's own voice. It repeated his own command back to him, word for word, with a hollow, mechanical delivery that contained zero human warmth. As the transmission cut out, Marcus looked out the tower window and saw a single bright light flash once from the sealed mine below. The horrors of the deep woods are rarely loud. They prefer to linger just on the periphery of your vision. Our fourth account comes from a wildlife photographer named Clara who was tracking nocturnal predators near the rocky ridges. She had set up a camouflage blind near a natural game trail, hoping to capture images of elusive mountain lions. As the midnight hour approached, the forest fell into that familiar, terrifying stillness that every seasoned woodsman fears. Clara felt the hairs on her arms stand up before she actually saw the cause of her sudden, primitive dread. Through the narrow slit of her canvas blind, she spotted a shadow standing perfectly still among the birch trees. It wasn't a bear on its hind legs, and it wasn't a lost hiker standing in the dark brush. The shape was impossibly tall, far too thin, its outline slightly blurred as if the dark air around it was vibrating. She didn't see a face, she didn't see claws, and she didn't see a monstrous mouth filled with jagged teeth. Instead, she experienced the absolute, crushing, psychological certainty of being completely and utterly hunted. The entity didn't move toward her. It simply stood there, absorbing the pale moonlight, radiating an aura of ancient malice. The feeling was so intense, so violent, that her mind began to fracture under the sheer weight of the terror. Her heart hammered against her ribs, her lungs refused to draw breath, and her limbs turned to lead. She realized that the mountains don't need to touch you to destroy you. They can simply let you know they are watching. When the sun finally rose, the shape dissolved into the morning fog, leaving Clara to stumble back to civilization with a broken spirit. That volatile nature of the mountain environment can turn a standard operation into a living nightmare in seconds. Our fifth account follows a form and volunteer search rescue team during a midnight sweep for a missing camper. The weather forecast had promised a clear, calm night, but the moment they entered the deep gorge, reality shattered. Within the span of 3 minutes, the temperature plummeted 40 degrees, dropping from a mild autumn evening to a freezing chill. A thick, unnatural fog rolled down the granite cliffs, reducing their high-powered headlamps to useless, blinding white walls. The team leader, an experienced tracker named David, called for his men to form a tight, arm-length perimeter line. But the mountain wasn't just changing the weather. It was actively distorting the physical space around them. David could hear the heavy boots of his team crunching on the gravel directly behind him in the white mist. He could hear their radio checks, their heavy breathing, and the clinking of their survival gear against their belts. But when he turned around to pass a warning down the line, the space behind him was entirely empty. The sounds of his men were still echoing all around him, bouncing off the fog, but the men themselves were gone. He screamed their names into the void, his voice swallowed instantly by the heavy, damp air of the canyon. The radios on his vest suddenly went dead silent, replaced by that same rhythmic, wet-breathing Marcus had heard miles away. David ran blindly, abandoning the search, guided only by pure survival instinct until he breached the park boundary at dawn. The rest of his team was found 3 days later, sitting together in a neat circle. In a clearing they had already searched. They were completely uninjured, but their minds were entirely gone, their eyes wide, staring blankly into the sky without speaking. The earth beneath our feet in these protected lands holds secrets that were buried long before the park lines were drawn. This leads us to our sixth account, involving a trail maintenance worker named Samuel, who was clearing debris after a landslide. Samuel was working in a deep, isolated ravine that had been cut off from the main tourist trails for decades. As his excavator pushed aside a massive mound of ancient black dirt and rotting root systems, he uncovered something solid, It wasn't a boulder, and it wasn't a piece of old mining equipment from the early industrial era. It was a large, rectangular slab of rough, hand-carved gray stone buried deep within the virgin earth. Samuel climbed down into the muddy trench with a shovel, brushing away the damp clay to reveal the surface of the marker. There were no names carved into the stone, no dates of birth, and no traditional words of remembrance or peace. Instead, the surface was covered in deep, jagged, freshly weeping grooves that spelled out a single, terrifying warning. The words read, "Do not dig them up, do not speak their names, for the dirt is the only thing keeping them asleep." As Samuel read the text, the heavy machinery behind him suddenly died, its electrical system completely burning out. A low, rhythmic vibration began to pulse through the soles of his boots, coming from the earth directly beneath the slab. The damp mud around the stone began to churn and bubble, as if something massive was shifting its weight far below. Samuel didn't wait for his foreman or report the find to the park archaeologists. He climbed out of the pit and ran. The ravine was permanently closed by a secondary, massive rockfall that very afternoon, burying the stone once more. As the night deepens toward the witching hour, the encounters in the dark become faster, more violent, and high tension. Our seventh account happens to a pair of off-grid campers, Liam and Ryan, who pitched their tent near a forgotten creek bed. At 2:45 a.m., they were violently awakened by the sound of heavy footsteps circling their nylon shelter in the dry leaves. The steps were irregular, heavy, then light, as if whatever was walking couldn't decide how many limbs it wanted to use. Liam reached for his hunting knife, while Ryan unzipped the small viewing window of the tent to look out into the dark, just 3 inches from the mesh screen, illuminated by the pale glow of the dying embers. Was a human face. But the features were entirely wrong. The eyes were completely black, dilated, and set too far apart on a hairless skull. The mouth was stretched into an impossibly wide, frozen grin that showed too many straight, white teeth. The entity didn't try to tear the tent. It simply pressed its cold, wet nose against the mesh, staring directly into Ryan's eyes. Before Liam could react, the creature opened its mouth and unleashed a deafening, high-pitched screech that shattered the quiet. The sound was a mix of a dying animal and a human scream, vibrating the very ground beneath their sleeping pads. The boys tore through the back wall of the tent, sprinting blindly through the dark brush, toward their truck parked miles away. They could hear the thing bounding through the canopy above them, snapping heavy branches as it kept pace with their panic. They made it to the vehicle, slamming the doors shut just as a heavy, pale hand slammed against the driver's side glass. They threw the truck into reverse, the headlights illuminating a tall, impossibly thin shape retreating back into the shadows. Our eighth and final account is the shortest, but perhaps the most chilling reminder of the rules of the woods. An experienced trail runner named Sarah was finishing a sunset loop when she realized she had miscalculated her time. The darkness caught her 2 miles from the trailhead, plunging the dense pine forest into total, suffocating blackness. She turned on her small running headlamp, her breath coming in heavy, ragged gasps as she picked up her pace. As she rounded a sharp bend near an old, dried-up well, she heard a voice call out from the heavy brush behind her. It was the voice of her mother, clear, loving, and entirely distinct, calling her childhood nickname from the dark. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her instinct screaming at her to turn around and run toward the familiar sound. But then a cold realization struck her mind like a physical blow. Her mother had passed away 5 years ago. The voice called out again, but this time the tone was slightly off, the pitch dropping into a low, raspy growl. At the end, Sarah remembered the unwritten law of the mountains, the rule passed down through generations of survivors. If you hear your name called from the pitch-black shadows of these ancient woods, no, you didn't. She kept her eyes locked on the gravel path ahead, refused to look back, and sprinted with everything she had left. She could hear something heavy crashing through the brush beside her, mimicking her mother's voice in a frantic, mocking chant. She burst through the trailhead gate into the bright lights of the parking lot, the entity stopping right at the tree line. The wilderness is not your friend, it is not your playground, and it is entirely indifferent to your survival. When you step off the asphalt and onto those isolated trails, you are entering a world that operates on ancient laws, laws that were written long before humanity learned to build fires, build roads, or print maps. Never hike alone, never look into the dark when you feel eyes on your back, and never answer to your name. Because in the deep woods of our national parks, your absolute silence is the only thing keeping you alive. If you have an account that needs to be told a truth you're afraid to keep inside, send it to my channel. And if you aren't afraid of what hides behind the brochure lie, subscribe to the narrator's shadow. I'll be right here, in the deep dark, waiting for you next week.